Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today, we're on a book club episode. We got Daniel Strange on today. He provided this book in an introduction by Daniel Strange. This book is actually by J.H. Bavinck, published by Westminster Seminary Press. You guys are going to learn about why it's by J.H. Bavinck, but we have Dan Strange on. So if you guys are new to that name, J.H. Bavinck will explain that. The Church Between Temple and Mosque, a study of the relationship between Christianity and other religions. So fascinating book. He's reintroducing J.H. Bavinck to the world. And so thank you, Dan Strange. So if you guys go to our show notes, there's a link to Westminster Seminary Press. This episode is brought to us by Westminster Seminary Press. And then obviously with our book club episodes, you can learn more about the author and the other works that are going on. So if you go to our show notes and click that, those links, and then obviously on YouTube, you could see the playlist for all the other book clubs as well. And so, like I just mentioned, if you subscribe to us on YouTube, you can watch these videos. You can listen to them on your favorite podcast catcher as well. So I assume that you're doing one of the two right now since you're listening or watching this episode. And then if you're not at a church to call home, there is a local church finder to help you out. You just click that link and select one of the denominations and then type in your zip code. So it's a helpful little guide there. And then we are on social media. We're on Twitter and Instagram. And then we have obviously an email as well. So if you ever want to reach out to Peter and myself. So something that I've been doing is reading a endorsement, and I'm gonna actually read two if you guys can bear with me, and they're quick and easy, but the first one's from the late great Tim Keller. We never had him on our show, but we've had people closely associated with him, and I know his recent passing, he's in our hearts right now. So I wanted to read Tim Keller's endorsement of Dan's book here. Anything from the pen of J.H. Bavinck is important to read. This work is even more valuable for the Western Church than it was when written, for the great religions of the world are now present in Europe and North America in numbers that could not have been imagined in the mid-20th century. Beyond that, the magnetic points are crucial for helping us speak to the religious and non-religious as well. Read this little gem of a book. So that's got to make you feel good, Dan, that Tim Keller wrote that for you. And then my last quick endorsement from James Eglinton. We've had him on the show a couple times before, and he's talked about J.H. Bavinck with us recently. So he wrote this about Dan's book. J.H. Bavinck is a sublime but neglected thinker. Through his psychological insights, global focus, and rich biblical theology, his works offer the reader a uniquely reformed perspective on Christianity and the Western culture it produced in relation to other faiths and cultures most deeply shaped by them. This book provides a sterling example of that. The Church Between Temple and Mosque is essential reading for Christians looking to understand other faiths as well as the uniqueness of their own. So I'll let Peter further introduce Daniel Strange today.
Yeah, we have Dr. Daniel Strange. He provided the introduction for this book from J.H. Bavinck. So Daniel Strange is director of Crosslands Forum and vice president of the Southgate Fellowship. His award-winning books include Their Rock is Not Like Our Rock, Plugged In, and Making Faith Magnetic. And that last book I would really recommend, obviously outside this book, for those who are looking to share their faith and what their faith means. So thanks for coming on the show, Dr. Strange.
No, it's great to be with you guys. Thanks for inviting me.
And I always ask this question, kind of an icebreaker question that our guest does not know, but I know. And this one, I cannot imagine you have not been asked. What's it like being such an integral part of the Marvel universe?
Yes, thank you. I kind of would have predicted that would have been the question. Look, here's some interesting facts. I am a Doctor Strange. My wife is a Doctor Strange. She's a psychologist. My middle name is Stephen. And the most bizarre thing is that my dad, and this is partly maybe getting into the discussion, but my dad was from originally from South America, from Guyana, which is a country at the top of South America. And his name wasn't Strange. He chose the name Strange when he came to the UK in the 60s.
Really?
Probably after the Marvel character.
Really?
So there's all kind, it's strange enough being called Strange, but there's a strange kind of history to that name. So my poor kids have to lumber with it.
It's a cool, but obviously strange last name.
Yes,
but it's a cool last name.
I can see being a kid. You're like, oh, this is getting really old. After a while, after all their friends are like, oh, your dad's Doctor Strange. He's a famous. Like, oh my gosh,
you got the Strange family.
Exactly. And I went to a school where for the first half it was still quite formal, so you were called by your second name. So I had 5 years of just being called Strange, which probably means that I need to be in therapy even now.
That's funny. That's good. So let's get to know the real in flesh Doctor Strange, not the Marvel Doctor Strange. So let our listeners know a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So as I said, I come from a mixed ethnic background. My dad was from South America, so his parents were Hindu believers. And I was converted in a Baptist church when I was 16. And then because of my grandparents' faith, I was always interested in theology. I was quite academic.
Sure.
So I went to a place called Bristol University to do theology and religious studies, which I'll come on to in a minute. It was a very, very kind of liberal degree.
Yeah.
And then I did a PhD looking at the work of Clark Pinnock and people who never hear the gospel, so the unevangelized.
Yep.
So that was my kind of systematics background. And then I kind of morphed into, I did theological student ministry work with theology students for 5 years, and then ended up taking a post at Oak Hill Theological College, which is a kind of reform seminary in the UK.
Okay.
And I was there for 16 years and as lecturer and then director. And then a few years ago, we started an in-context theological training thing called Crosslands, which was kind of came out of Oak Hill and Acts 29.
Oh, okay,
and I was I kind of was involved with the beginning of that. And then a few years ago, I made the move from Oak Hill to Crosslands, which is now completely independent. So we offer kind of theological education from first steps in discipleship through to PhD. I head up something called Crosslands Forum, which is a centre for cultural religion, cultural engagement. So doing the things I have been doing in seminary, but I suppose to a broader audience. I'm a fellow of the Keller Centre for Cultural Apologetics.
Yep.
I'm a visiting professor at Southeastern Baptist. That's where we get our stuff accredited from for Crosslands. Married to Ellie. We've got 7 kids and a foster daughter as well. So busy life.
Yeah, I was about to say the fact that you can still do what you do with 7 kids, adopted kid, that's pretty cool.
That's cool.
That's the magic. That's the Marvel magic.
Hey, how many multiverses are you
There's
living
a lot
in?
of. Well, sometimes I feel as if I'm living in about an infinite number, but yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
So as we kind of briefly mentioned earlier, and I read the endorsement from James Eglinton, we had him on the show recently. We're really reintroducing the Bavinck family and especially J.H. Bavinck recently. He came on and he was talking about his translation and editing work of J.H. Bavinck's Personality and Worldview book. And that book is more of a series of lectures. This one's a little different and different audience in mind. And and so with your book, your introduction to J.H. Bavinck's book, The Church Between Temple and Mosque. Obviously, maybe you could briefly answer why we're not having J.H. Bavinck on this episode for the people that don't know.
Yes.
But who's made up of the original audience of this book that we're talking about today, and why did J.H. deliver it to them in particular?
Yes. So J.H. is the nephew of the much more famous Bavinck in reform circles anyway, called Herman Bavinck. So it's J.H. We call him J.H. because his name was Johannes Herman, so it could get incredibly confusing.
That's right.
So JH, yeah. So he was born in 1895. He died in 1964. He was a Dutch Reformed missionary in Indonesia and Jakarta, and then in the later part of his career, he went back to the Netherlands and was lecturing in missiology at the Free University of Amsterdam and other places as well.
Mm-hmm.
And this particular book was actually based on a series of lectures that he gave that in about 1960 in the States.
Yeah.
In probably the Federated Theological Faculty of Chicago. And he'd been invited over. In the world of the study of religion, there's one of the godfathers of religious studies was a Romanian scholar called Mircea Eliade. And he'd read one of Bavinck's earlier books called Religious Consciousness, and he invited Bavinck over. So I think this is probably the case, that he came and gave these lectures on the invitation of Eliade, and then they were published after he died. So this is a posthumous work, and then Erdemans picked it up, and it was in print for quite a while. But then in about it was long out of print. But I stumbled across it a few years ago, and I've always found it very helpful. And that was the kind of the how I got into reading JH. So around 1960 he gave these lectures, so this book actually wasn't translated, or I don't know whether there was an original translation. This was always in English originally. So
which is different than Personality and Worldview, which was
translated, and that was given to a group of like lay technical students at the early part of Bavinck's career. This book, The Church Between Temple and Mosque, is probably the high point of his writing. There's three books that I'd say are the kind of his high point of writing. This book called Religious Consciousness, his Introduction to the Science of Missions, and that's really his most famous book,
which is fantastic.
Because Ed Clowney loved it, translated it. And then that was very influential in the work of Harvey Conn, and then Harvey Conn very influential in the work of Tim Keller. So there's a kind of a direct lineage from J.H. Bavinck down to Keller.
We read it at Westminster during my studies there.
And it's still, it was written in 1960. It's still incredibly, like, some of the issues he deals with, it's dated to a certain extent, but it's incredible. So this little gem, I suppose, came out of those lectures. So that's something about how the book came to be.
Awesome.
And for people that haven't heard the term missiologist, and you said JH is a 20th century missiologist, what does that mean?
I think, great question. I think, for me, it's just someone who is interested in teaching about the mission of God and what that means for church. And Bavinck has a great way of defining mission. I mean, I know we have a lot of talk about mission. One, he says missiology should be at the forefront of every theological curriculum. Amen to that. And that mission is about the glorification of God, the upbuilding of believers, the making of disciples, and evangelizing. And all of those things need to go together. It's not just one or the other. And when we do one, we're doing the other too. So he has a kind of a very holistic view of mission. And certainly he thought that missiology, the study of mission, should be all students should be learning about it. And I think especially in the West, and maybe, in the UK and in the States as well, one of my passions is trying to encourage seminaries that missiology has to take a central part, not just for those who are going into cross-cultural situations, which has been the traditional way of doing mission and mission agencies, but that all people studying theology for pastoral ministry, there has to be a missiological focus to it, given the state of the culture that we're in at the moment.
Totally.
Yeah. And kind of additionally adding off to that first question I had, just so people can lay out foundation in terms and things like that and wrap their heads around this before we go into deeper content. What is the significance of the title of this book? Because when you pick it up, the church between the temple and the mosque, and then you look at the cover, you obviously have a Christian church, and then on one side you have a Jewish temple, and on the other side a Islamic mosque. So what is the significance of the title of the book, do you think?
I think Bavinck's trying to explore to a group of theology and religious studies students what is religion, and that's what the first part of the book is about. So in that sense, that's why he gave it to those university students. I think the importance is, two things, as you noted in the Tim Keller commendation. One is that mission now is from everywhere to everywhere, and because of immigration, we're dealing with a lot of different people who would be called come from other religious worldviews. And I use religion in that kind of. I don't really like the word, but let's use it for the moment. But also that Bavinck in this book and in other books, he starts to say, well, actually, there's a sense in which even in our secular post-Christian context, the same kind of the analysis of the human is still the same. So I think that this book, the worst thing for this book would be if people just think, oh, it's great in terms of I'm trying to understand my religious neighbors, so those who are Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's also actually very applicable just to evangelism and apologetics and cultural analysis for everyone.
Yep.
And that's where I hope it gets a new hearing, because I think it's very translatable, even though in Bavinck's Indonesian context, he was dealing with what we might call more formal religions at that point.
That makes sense. Yeah, because to be human is to be religious, as you'll talk about. And then so getting getting more personal between you and J.H. Bavinck, why he's so important to you. You happen to get this come across this book in a crucial time in your life during your universal studies and wrestling with comparative religions. Could you kind of take us back to that time?
Yeah, sure.
Background.
So I mean, I was definitely I was converted, and I knew that I was an evangelical Christian, whatever that meant. And I chose to go and study theology and religious studies in a very liberal, radically liberal kind of department in one of the main universities in the UK. And I went there because the guy who taught me doctrine, who actually became my PhD supervisor, is a guy called Gavin da Costa, who's probably the world authority on Roman Catholic views of Christianity and other religions. And he was very sympathetic towards confessional conservative believers, even though he was a Catholic. So I actually went to study as an undergraduate because he was there, but actually he was by far the most conservative person. The rest of it was very radically liberal. And so I remember just in my first few doctrine lessons or religious studies where you're taught to kind of, you're coming from a neutral standpoint, you need to suspend your judgments. I was just I staggered into the library looking at the reading list thinking, this is not what I expected as a believing Christian who believes in the finality of Jesus Christ for salvation. I'd already had a kind of an awkward run-in with the professor of the department who found out that I'd been a missionary for a year and told me that I was not to do any of that in her department. So I was looking for any point of contact really in the library and the reading list to think, what am I going to look at that helps me orientate what I'm studying with my faith? And I think it was the Scottish Bulletin of Evangelical Theology. They'd republished what is actually chapter 9 in this book, Human Religion in God's Sight. Which was really Bavinck's exposition of Romans chapter 1. And it was an oasis, because I thought, okay, there is something here that I can grasp hold of. And then that led me, I think there was a bit of Leslie Newbigin as well that was in the library. So from those little beginnings, and then I started trying to read as much as I can of JH. So as I say at the beginning of the book, my kind of spiritual sanity was preserved by JH Bavinck when I was like 18 or 19. And I thank God for just stumbling across that first article, because that kind of opened the gateway to reading about JH much more.
Yeah, I think like it did for you, I think it'll help a lot of people, especially younger generations who are kind of moving into. I think this is a great pre-college. Christians who are moving into college, and they're probably, if they're going to Christian or if they're going to kind of a secular university, it's a great introduction to how do I interact with other faiths. How do I understand another faith? What's my faith in the midst of other faiths? I think it's great for some of that introduction. So roughly, and you kind of talked about this a little bit, and we'll dive in more about the first half of this book is we'll call a theological look. And I want you to explain theological versus kind of like religious history and whatnot into various religions rather than purely historical. And again, if you can kind of divvy those things up. The second half is an exegetical look, like you just said, of Romans 1, mapped onto, which I think is fantastic, current religious landscape, and more particularly Eastern, which I think is fascinating for an American audience. So broadly speaking, what is JH doing in these two halves?
So it's interesting because I think he's exploring what is religion. That's what the book is about, really. What do we mean by religion? And the book starts by him just talking about different ways, different religious scholars who were present, who were very famous at the time.
Yeah.
How do you define religion? How do you categorize religion? So that's the kind of opening. And then he does a section where this is where this idea of the magnetic points comes in. He says, look, as I do my comparative religion, there seem to be certain questions that all religions ask. And he puts these into 5 kind of categories.
Yeah.
There's the idea of cosmic relationship. There's the idea of a norm. There's the idea of activity and passivity. So, we lead our lives, but we undergo our lives, destiny or fate or human freedom. There's stuff on redemption, the thirst for redemption, he calls it. And then there's the kind of the big unknown in the background. And these are ideas that he's trailed elsewhere. He covers them a little bit in his book on religious consciousness, but they're in a slightly different order. So he says, look, all human beings are kind of asking these questions. And what he does in that first half of the book, he's just go through a number of lived traditions that he was in contact from, animism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and just shows how these people scratched these particular religious itches that they all have. So he's doing his own kind of religious anatomy or morphology or comparative religion. And then what he does is he says, okay, this is how humans have kind of understood religion. These are my observations. Now, what does the Bible say? So I wouldn't want to give the impression that this is a kind of a natural theology. I think it's a tactical. He starts with kind of, well, this is what the scholars have said. This is what we observe. And now, how does this fit with what the Bible says? And he almost goes back to the beginning and shows how Romans 1, so it's really, he just bases himself in Romans 1 in an exegesis. And then the genius of the book is then he comes back to show how in the gospel, in Jesus Christ, all of these itches that human beings have, or these questions, these magnetic points, they're all answered in the gospel. And so he goes through each one of them, just showing how Christ both kind of confronts but also connects with these magnetic points. And that's the book.
Yeah, that's good. So before next question, and just I think this is helpful for audience, and I think especially so for our younger audience. If you can explain, and Bavinck goes through this, and you even described this in your introduction, the difference between a theological look at comparative religions and kind of historical look at comparative religions.
Yeah. So I think Bavinck is saying that we can observe things, and people have tried to define religion in human terms. But for Bavinck, in the second half of the book, he kind of stops and says, okay, what does God's revelation say about this? Okay. So he's kind of he's presupposing the truth of God's word.
Gotcha.
And so then he's looking at the same phenomena through the lenses of the Bible. And he sees a great, he says it's kind of the observations are confirmed, the Bible confirms these observations, but actually the Bible has to come first. And that's why the Romans 1 passage becomes seminal for how we're to understand what's going on in terms of what is religion and these particular magnetic points. So in that sense, it's a very evangelical way of reading the world through the word. But I think for apologetic reasons, he just starts with, well, this is what the scholars have said, and there's some bits that are helpful and some are not. There are these kinds of magnetic points, but then he tries to give it some exegetical substance, which then comes first, and that's the second half of the book. So that's the kind of the way the book's laid out.
Gotcha. Yeah. So maybe to compress it a little bit, it's maybe the history of religions or comparative religions from a purely secular point. I was like, what do religions say? How are they different from each other? What are the questions that are asking? Versus maybe a theological look is, okay, we're going to presuppose the truth of the gospel, and then how does the gospel fulfill all the longings of those other religions?
Yes, and that those longings actually are exegetically grounded.
Gotcha.
As well. So in that sense, it's not a natural theology in that way. It's a very biblical way, but something that engages with the world as we see it, as we understand it. And I think that's important.
Awesome.
And obviously J.H. Bavinck is Christian. I mean, that's very obvious.
Yep.
And
Yes.
Reformed,
so
yeah. Dutch Reformed. Yeah, he's
Yep, Dutch
very
Reformed.
Christian.
So I only bring out that obvious fact because surprisingly enough, it may not immediately strike a reader until they start reading the book that he's really focusing on Eastern religious traditions to an American audience. So people are like, "What is he?
Yeah, a
What's
Dutch
he?
guy on Eastern religions to an American audience.
And that's great. Yeah.
I mean, I presume that's the setting that he's talking to theological students who might have been studying comparative religions because it was on the invitation of a great scholar of religion. And it's interesting in the book, I mean, even Islam, he deals with it. I think the Islam that he was engaging with in Indonesia is quite a kind of a mystical, almost Sufi kind of tradition.
Yeah.
But he also deals with kind of animism and the kind of African primal religion. So it's a kind of even though it's in America in the 1960s in Chicago, it's in an academic setting. But that's the point. It's even more relevant now. And the big idea that all human beings have a religious consciousness, whether they call themselves religious or not, I think that's the big take home for in our post-Christendom context. Because Bavinck's definition of religion, having looked at what all the scholars say, he says, look, as I read Romans 1, religion is a response to divine revelation. It's the way that we suppress the truth and substitute it for idols. And that is what he calls the religious consciousness of human beings. So the religious consciousness is his big kind of insight that all of us have this religious consciousness. And it's not necessarily a positive thing. It's what's going on in Romans 1, but that there's still there's some traction there because we're image bearers who suppress the truth. And we all ask these magnetic point questions. And that's where the gospel both connects and confronts.
Yeah, I think like so many people that will read this book, probably same experience I had is it's kind of an aha moment of based on he's clarifying terms of that religious consciousness is so helpful because you're like, of course, yeah, to be human is to be religious. And obviously we're made in God's image and it would be nice if everyone was Christian, but there's kind of an explanation of why the other religions exist, why we're all pulled to look to something divine and above us. So actually, part of my question too is based on his audience he's talking to, comparing Christianity, other religions, Eastern religions, what was his intention behind this approach? Because obviously he wasn't just like, oh, I forgot I was talking to an American audience. Like, what was his intention? And you might have already answered this, but I think it's worth kind of repeating. Why is he such an expert in all? You're talking about he's a Christian Dutch Reformed guy. Why is he such an expert in these other religions?
So he was a missionary in Indonesia for many years. And quite a radical one. It's interesting. I was preaching in a church in Northern Ireland last year, and a little old lady who must have been in her mid-80s came up to me, and she said, "I can't believe you're talking about J.H. Bavinck. I'm a retired missionary, and when I was a little girl, J.H. came to preach in our church." So there's still like a line of continuity. But her point was, J.H., from what we know about him, he was a very gentle, humble guy, but he was quite controversial because even when he was in Indonesia, he was talking about contextualization. He was talking about understanding, taking the things that have been going on in the culture and trying to possess them for the gospel or use them for the gospel in quite a radical way. And so in that sense, his experience on the mission field of trying to indigenize the Reformed faith for the context he was in means that I think he had an affinity. And there is something, I think, his PhD was looking at a particular mystic, a guy called Heinrich von Suso. He was always interested in a kind of a more mystical kind of Christianity, which he knew was his own temptation sometimes to be drawn to. And I think, as one person says, he's not so much a systematic thinker. He's more a kind of a seer and a bit of a prophet. And his writing has a kind of a evocative, kind of almost like sensual kind of way of writing. He's got a great turn of phrase, and he's very interested in that. And I think the other thing, which is very interesting, Nick, to your question, is as James Eglinton points out, he was very interested in what was then the kind of growing discipline of psychology. And so it's interesting, psychoanalysis, there's a lot of psychoanalytic language, the way that he translates, in Romans 1 that we've suppressed the truth. And he says, well, yes, that's like repression. So he's kind of, and I think there's a very psychological way that he tries to understand things, which again, I think is really interesting if we're trying to transpose his kind of analysis to what might be the 21st century West. I imagine he had to talk about other religions because that was the course he was teaching. But again, his experience had told him that, there are these perennial questions that humans beings ask. And he starts hinting towards what that might mean for America in, say, the 1960s and certainly now in the 21st century.
Yeah. And so that goes into this next question. It's one of the strands, and I think one of the more dominant strands throughout this book. And he talks about this throughout and compares religions and kind of plots them. It doesn't say like, okay, there's this hard line, but it does plot them between law religions and redemptive religions. So you describe what is JH doing here, and how does he see these threads through the religions that he profiles?
So I think he notes in the beginning, that people have categorized religions as law and redemptive, and it's not that he says that that's unhelpful. I think he thinks that on closer inspection, actually, it's a little more complicated than that, and actually sometimes law follows redemption, and sometimes redemption follows law. And so I think he's trying to say that the law and deliverance are two of the magnetic points. One is this idea of the religious norm, that all religions have a kind of a norm or some kind of standard to which people must adhere.
Yeah.
And I think he'd say a lot of religions have redemption as well. Obviously, in some religions, law seems to predominate over deliverance or redemption, and vice versa. But the great thing about his analysis is that he kind of says all of those, both aspects are there all the time.
Yeah.
But one might be more strongly leading. So I think he would probably say, yes, in terms of Islam, maybe law does dominate over salvation, but there's still a kind of an idea of deliverance.
Totally.
And again, the way he talks about redemption, it's not simply a looking forward, it's a looking back. And there's a kind of a nostalgia to it as well. So there's it's I think in his own definition, he'd want to say that both law and redemption are both perennial questions, even though they might be shaped a little differently according to the tradition that you're looking at.
Yeah, because if you can speak to this too, from what Bavinck notes, is maybe more specific on redemptive. I think as Christians, we can place our understanding of redemption or our understanding of salvation or heaven on other religions and say that's what they're looking for too. But he goes a slightly different route with that. He's like, that's not all what they're looking for. So maybe describe like how is he helping Christians see, okay, let's not plot our definition of this on other religions.
So on the one hand, he's very clear that we can't Christianize. No, Jesus Christ is something other, and actually it's disrespectful to the other to just Christianize other religions.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think he is saying that the point of contact is that these magnetic points are all kind of questions that people ask that actually do relate to the gospel.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of quite a fine line. On the one hand, he's saying we mustn't Christianize, and we need to understand religion of traditions on their own term. We need to listen carefully. But on the other hand, there is always a point of contact that means that human beings are basically asking or dealing with the same kinds of questions. So in that sense, he gives a kind of a chance to do a comparative religions, but not in a way that is kind of as you said, just kind of in an unnuanced way, just kind of saying, well, because another
it's a systematic way of doing. Okay, you place this here, place that there.
Exactly.
It's a little more normal.
There's a bit where he talks about, not in this book, so he talks about how that people ask these questions is what's in common.
Yeah.
How people answer the questions is completely different. But I think that's great. And, the great thing about the Romans 1 passage that is that it's, all of us learn stuff about worldview, and everyone has a worldview. Everyone asks questions. So this is what partly some of the stuff on worldview that the book that James has translated, the difference between a worldview and a world vision.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be a helpful concept to us. What I think is great about this later Bavinck thinking is that these worldview questions, these magnetic points, don't come out of thin air. They're exegetically tied to Romans 1. So he says, the invisible qualities that God has revealed, his human power and divine nature, they are the kind of the clay out of which the magnetic points are shaped, as in, at some level, human beings know that we're dependent upon something or someone. And at some level, we know that we're accountable to something or someone. People answer those questions in all kinds of idolatrous ways. And Bavinck likens it to dreaming. He says, look, when you dream, you're taking something in reality and you're twisting it and distorting it. And that's what the religious consciousness does. And that's what the magnetic points do. It's taking the reality of God's revelation in his goodness, which is good revelation. It's and we are the ones who twist it and distort it. But idolatry is always parasitic on the truth. There's always a truth suppressed in these magnetic points. And that gives us the point of contact to then say something about how Christ both confronts, because there has to be repentance, turning around, but also there's a connection between the way people have answered those magnetic points and the questions and what Jesus comes to do and who Jesus is.
Yeah. And so another strand, so my last question before Nick's last question. And I don't think Bavinck says this directly, but I think as a modern audience, we start seeing this more specifically. He talks about kind of the drive inward in a lot of Eastern religions and the drive outward in other religions. So there's some emphasis like the inner self, like get to know yourself, get deeper into yourself, find the revelation within yourself.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's kind of like the deliverance is the farther in, the more delivered you are, the more pure you are, the more enlightened you become. And I think people who hear that today is like, that is to a T, kind of the self-consciousness that we have today, the therapeutic self. So how might this work from JH help us better understand not just Eastern religions, obviously Eastern religions, but also kind of modern spiritual inwardness?
Yeah. Well, look, one of the books that I found really helpful in understanding where America is at the moment on some of these issues, but where the West is a book by Tara Isabella Burton called Strange Rites, where she's done this great phenomenological study of modern day, what we could call spirituality. And the recognition is that those people who call themselves the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, who say they have no religion, all of them believe in all kinds of things. And that's a brilliant book on just charting where America is at the moment, not as individuals and as a culture. And she does great things in kind of charting this therapeutic kind of deism from manifesting through to kind of, capitalizing on these kinds of things. Yeah. And I think that fits really well with Bavinck's understanding of religious consciousness. And I think as we're talking about in all these discussions we're having about identity, the more we drive inward, we as human beings, we know that we're not God. And we always have to create things to legitimize ourselves, as in we create idols because we think that they are going to save us. But actually, because we don't know who we are, the idols are shaky themselves. I mean, that's what Isaiah 41 is brilliantly talking about. And I think that drive inward just makes us more insecure because we need an external reference point to define ourselves. And again, in terms of theology, I think this is the great thing about Church Between Temple and Mosque. It's that we need God's revelation. We need an outside, a word from another world to tell us who we are, who God is, what's the problem, what's the solution. And that's where we cannot define ourselves. We need someone else to do that for us. And that's where Bavinck at the end of the book goes through these magnetic points and says, it's Christ who gives us connection. It's Christ who is the norm. It's Christ who delivers us. It's Christ who actually is in control, and yet we still have responsibility. And it's Jesus Christ who is the answer to the great unknown. He is the way, the truth, and the life. And I think that's the great thing about the book that then just translates so well to a generation of people who are searching for meaning. I mean, that's the thing. I think, these studies that, people who are not religious, they are still looking for some kind of meaning.
100%. Yeah.
And we've got great news to tell them in terms of what it means to be human, what human identity is, and introduce them to Christ.
Yeah, and that was what was just, as I was reading, getting further in, it was so fascinating. Written in 1960, or I guess published in 1965, or posthumously post-death published, in writing exclusively about Eastern religions, but then just so darn similar to what we have today. You realize how influenced we are by some of these concepts.
I think the thing I would say, Peter, that is one distinction that's important, and that I've tried to do in my book, Making Faith Magnetic. It's taking the magnetic points and trying to transpose them for our post-Christendom context in terms of examples. And I do think the big difference is in Bavinck's context, the kind of this idea, this fifth magnetic point, the great unknown, or in other places he calls it the higher power.
Yeah.
I think when Bavinck's in Indonesia, everyone believes in a God. Everyone believes in a higher power. The question is, which is the higher power that's going to give me connection, norm, deliverance, destiny? In our context, it's the magnetic point, this fifth one, that's deeply kind of needs to be excavated. And it's only as we press in on the other magnetic point. So there's a kind of an inverse thing going on here, which I do think is very different in terms of what you might call, secular spirituality. There's got to be a lot more excavation to get that idea of transcendence, which goes back to these big discussions about that I talk about elsewhere about, are we disenchanted as a culture? Are we enchanted? But Burton wants to say, actually, there's some truth in disenchantment, but actually modern day America is very enchanted in terms of people believe all kinds of things. And that's what I think we need confidence in. And it goes back to Nick's point that, as Paul says, people of Athens, I see you're very religious. It's people of America, people of the UK, I see you are very religious. But I think we have to be more creative. And that's why I don't like the term religion, because it still corrals people into, oh, I'm not religious. But we need to, thinking biblically with biblical lenses on, it's that we're all religious. We might not use that term because it would just annoy people, but we know theologically these people are religious. They are asking these magnetic points. They have a religious consciousness. They're running from God and running to him. They know him and they don't know him, which is what Romans 1 says. And that's our point of contact to say something of Christ.
That's awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm going to make my last question a two-parter. So you guys both know my last question because you have it in front of you. But because, and Peter knows what's coming, when we're doing good on time, I create like a bonus question. So I'm going to add. You
always scare me.
Yeah, but no, this is good. Actually, I've been hearing some of the language in this conversation that's going to make this bonus question before my last question helpful.
You get extra credit if you answer this right, Dr. Strange.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
I'm there.
No, this is good because it kind of wraps some stuff up too. We know the three of us firmly believe Christianity is the truth, the only way to salvation. And you mentioned John 14:6. I am the way. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
Yeah.
We've also talked about Romans 1. Okay. So here's my first part of the question. And it actually is followed up by my last question really well. So why what would you think J.H. Bavinck would say? And what would you say? Why do you think God even allows other religions to even exist if Christianity is actually true and God is sovereign and in control? Couldn't he have just made it where Christianity, which was previously Judaism, was the only religion in the world?
Great question. Well, okay. So the short answer would be, in my big book on other religions, Their Rock is Not as Our Rock, I have a whole chapter on why God has allowed other religions. So you can go and read that. I think, I think there's lots of reasons for that. I mean, in some ways, the question is, why does idolatry exist at all? And I think as a Reformed believer, ultimately, if everything is for God's glory, then I think God's glory is displayed in both judgment and mercy from sin in terms of idolatrous religions. I think there are common grace reasons why other religions can give a a restraint on sin.
Hmm.
There is a kind of, I mean, again, this is hard, but I think it's true. Just as Paul talks about why Pharaoh's heart was hardened so that God's glory could be manifest, I think there is something glorious about the way in which people are saved from, turn from idols to the living God, which glorifies God, and as God saves people by grace through faith. So I think there are all kinds of reasons why other religions exist, but I think the key thing there is, and again, as I write in my more academic work in this book on other religions, I think seeing other religions as fundamentally idolatrous is, I think, very helpful. I think that's how the Bible talks about this idea of religious consciousness. And really, all humans beings have this religious consciousness. And what we call religion formally is just people who have thought the same kinds of things in terms of their religious consciousness and idolatry. So I think that's one of the reasons. It's that messy mixture of the image of God, the suppression of truth, common grace. If you stir that all up together, what you get is this religious consciousness. And however much there might be commonality to a certain extent, at the end of the day, it calls for repentance and faith in Christ. And that's I think Bavinck's very clear on that, and so would I be as well.
Nice.
I'll make one little correction to what Nick said. Is it's always been Christianity. It wasn't Judaism and then turned into Christianity. It's a good Reformed Presbyterian. The gospel is in the Old Testament.
Yeah, continuity.
There we go. Yeah.
But I think, sorry, go on, Nick.
No, please say what you're going to say first.
Oh, no. Well, I mean, if it was the second part of your question, I just think the model that I've talked about a lot, and actually this isn't J.H. Bavinck, this is my other work, and Keller's picked up on it as well, is this idea of subversive fulfillment. And I think the magnetic points, that these itches that we have to scratch, the gospel always confronts, but it always connects, and it does both, because idolatry is always parasitic. So there's always going to be kind of points of contact, but the gospel both subverts and it fulfills. And Bavinck's clear on that. In other work, Bavinck does a great exegesis of Acts 17 as well as Romans 1. On the one hand, he's saying, look, Jesus is not the unknown God that the Athenians worshipped. If you think there's like a straight line from kind of paganism through to Jesus, it's not a direct fulfillment. But Paul has to start somewhere, and Bavinck says, the missionary inhales all kinds of danger when you're kind of finding a point of contact, because you don't want to be misunderstood. But from there, he builds out, he subverts from the inside. And whether you call it subversive fulfillment, Tim Keller says, this idea of yes, no, yes, you're onto something here. No, you won't find it, but yes, it's fulfilled in Jesus Christ. But the key thing is that Acts 17 passage is always bookended in repentance. Paul is distressed at the idolatry he sees in Athens, and he calls people to repentance. And as long as you've got those bookends in mind, there's a lot of kind of listening to the culture, trying to understand what's going on, trying to understand it theologically, and building, subverting, but fulfilling. And I think I found that very helpful in trying to understand how we engage with culture in general and other religions as well. Jesus Christ is always the subversive fulfillment of all those religious desires and longings, which are the suppressed truth of the religious consciousness.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm glad I asked that bonus question. So it's helpful. And leading into my real last question.
Yeah.
Because it's tied to it, really.
Yeah,
and so practically speaking, for evangelism, connecting us Christians to people from other religions, so sharing, what would be some maybe shared capital we have with other religions and truths that they stumble upon that we can kind of come alongside them and see where they're at, and they have the right maybe intention, but they have the wrong religion.
Yeah.
and say, hey, you know what? This is Christianity. This is what you've been looking for in the wrong spots. By that understanding of a shared capital of other religions, to introduce them to the fulfillment in Jesus Christ.
Well, that's where these magnetic points are so helpful. because whether it's a Buddhist, a Hindu, someone who's been watching too much Oprah, someone who's bought a Gwyneth Paltrow product, someone who's manifesting, all of these things, it's saying that at the end of the day, this human search for 1, connection, 2, a norm, 3, deliverance, 4, some kind of destiny, and 5, a kind of, is there a reality beyond reality? It's saying that in some ways, human beings are looking for those things. Yes, they're looking for them in all the wrong places. And if you continue doing this, it will only lead to destruction, despair, and what this has done to your relationship with God. But we find true connection, we find a true norm, we find true deliverance, we find our true destiny in Jesus Christ and in his church. I think that is where we make the connection points. And that's the natural kind of, you don't have to do a kind of an awkward gear shift from, but one of the things I struggle with at the moment is that I do think in our post-Christian context, we're struggling to get traction, I think, from where normal people are, as in they're just living their lives. They're not thinking about any of this stuff. And that's probably where Bavinck has an advantage because, people I think Bavinck was engaging with in Indonesia, they're religious people in that sense.
They're already thinking about it.
Exactly. But we have to generate that. One of my favorite verses is that passage in Isaiah 44, where it's talking about the idolater who, worships an idol, makes their dinner, their supper, then uses the stuff. But the key verse there is Isaiah 44:10. No one stops to think. And I think we have to increasingly help people to stop and think what they're doing, why they're doing it, asking questions, listening carefully, and knowing that the connection is there. And it's an encouragement, from my non-Christian family or friend who shows no interest in anything religious or spiritual. We live by faith to say, well, the Bible says something different. The Bible tells me they are in a relationship with God. They do know, they are suppressing the truth. They are trying to live their lives. Not that they're asking these magnetic points questions consciously, but their lives living out the answers to connection and norm and destiny and deliverance. And that's our opportunity then to connect that to Christ. And that's what I think the magnetic points are so helpful in giving us a kind of a framework to be able to do that.
Wow. Yeah, that's really helpful because you hear, and it happens in our own minds where we can get frustrated. Why aren't people connecting with me? Why can't I'm preaching the gospel, but nobody's caring about this, and nobody seems to be asking the same questions. But it's because it makes sense, like you said, we're in Bavinck's time, and you can say pre-1960s ish, maybe depending on where you put the time marker. These were kind of in the waters already, so people were already asking these questions. So it's I guess the tension point was a little bit easier to find. But today it's not like you can't find it. You just have to realize that people today are asking the same questions, but they are not they're not thinking outside of a kind of a secular materialist, maybe, although they have kind of spiritual, they have spiritual ideas.
Exactly.
But they're in this materialist universe.
And in that, we have to be creative. We can't just we have to be creative. We have to be innovative. We have got to listen. I mean, Bavinck was someone who talks about meeting other people in love, listening to where people are coming from. As we wander around the objects of worship in 21st century America and the UK, what are the equivalents of the unknown gods today? And I think that does take some very careful listening, and we need to do that at the level of the local church, because it's going to be different in different. The more that I come across to the States, the more I realize, wow, this is an amazingly diverse country in terms of all kinds of. And again, we need to be contextualizing this material for our own locality. But when we do that, I think we will find, if we look at the world through these magnetic points, I think we'll start to see more opportunities of engagement, because we believe that, the Bible is true about what it says about people. And it was true in Bavinck's Indonesia, and it's true in 21st century America and the UK.
Yeah, and real quick too, that just highlighting the part that you said Bavinck was good at listening to where people were, going to where they are. And isn't that what God did? I mean, God came down to where we are in Jesus. I mean, God became human, came down to where we are. And then while Jesus was here on earth, that's how he spoke to people. He came to where they were.
Yeah.
And he explained who he was, where they would be came down to their level to understand who he was.
Yeah. And I think at that point, Nick, our posture is so key. And this is what I love about Bavinck. He's kind of hardcore Reformed theology. You know, you need to repent, but the way that he does that, he's so full of grace. He has this great line where he says, the wound with which we inflict on other people, we know that the wound has been turned on us first, as in, you know, we're just one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread, and it's all by grace. And I think especially at the moment, not our message, but our posture as we give that message in terms of being grace-filled is so crucial. It doesn't we're not watering down the truth. Bavinck's very clear on people need to repent and believe the gospel to be saved. And yet it's done not out of vainglory or malice, but it's done out of careful listening and loving the other person by contextualizing them and trying to understand where they're coming from. And that's the good of that's a great religious studies scholar, but it should be also the case for all of us as we wander around the objects of worship in the place where God has placed us.
A humble servant, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's as we end, it's a needed word. I'm assuming in the UK, England, across the world, and also in American kind of reform circles where, like you said, we can be on the high, like the fire and brimstone, which there's need for that sometimes. But if that's all we do, then we're not getting to know the people around us and contextualizing. And that's, he said, not watering down, but seeing where does the gospel hit them? How can we find those points? And I think Bavinck does a great job of kind of guiding us through his work. So thanks so much for coming on, Dr. Strange. It's been a pleasure.
It's a privilege. Thank you.
Your break from the Marvel universe and coming over here to teach us about Bavinck. It's been a pleasure.
I'm now going to enter a portal and go to another realm and do something with two other people on a different podcast. See you later.
No, sounds good. Cool. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.